Well, if you have your Bibles today, I want you to turn to Joshua chapter 7, which is where we're going to pick up in our series called Strong and Courageous. If this is your first week here, don't worry, because there's really only one thing you need to know this far that is pertinent to what's going to happen today in the Scripture, and that's that Israel has had nothing but victory up to this point in the story. Joshua takes over for Moses. Moses had kind of a rough time leading the people of Israel. They did a lot of complaining, and they made a lot of mistakes, and they spent way more time in the wilderness than they needed to. But then Joshua takes over, and Israel enters into a new season, not only of leadership, but also it's just success after success after success. Some of the things that Joshua has done up to this point in his leading of Israel is he has taken them across the Jordan River, which was super important because they finally stepped into the promised land that God had been telling them about for probably over hundreds and hundreds of years. And they finally get into the promised land. Not only that, but they actually renew the covenant. They have a covenant renewal, or they did all kinds of stuff. I'm not going to go into detail there, but they renewed the covenant with God. Let's just say that. And they had a miraculous victory over Jericho as well, where they had the craziest battle strategy of all time, which was to walk around the city and sing out loud. And the walls fell down after they did it. But there's an asterisk next to the victory at Jericho. If you don't know this, there's a man named Barry Bonds that played in the Major League Baseball back in 2001. And in 2001, he did something pretty incredible. He set the single-season home run record. He had 73 home runs in 2001. I'm not much of a baseball fan, but I know that that's the record, so I assume that's pretty impressive. He played for the San Francisco Giants during this time, but it came out after the fact that many believe that he was actually using illegal enhancement drugs to do so. And so to this day, it still says 73 home runs, and it says 2001, and it says single-season home run record, but there's an asterisk next to it because that all has to be taken with the supposed knowledge that he used illegal sports-enhancing drugs to do so. That's what the asterisk represents. And unfortunately for the Israelites, they just come out of Jericho. They have this miraculous win, but we have to put an asterisk next to it because something happened in Jericho that we're about to find out what it was. If you're in Joshua chapter 7 already, you'll see in the first verse, the narrator, the writer of Joshua, this is no one in the story, this is the person telling the story, just comes out and says it to us in the first verse. But the Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zimri, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of them. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel. So the narrator comes out and tells us, this is what the asterisk is. There was an incredible, miraculous victory, but somebody in the Israelite camp did the one thing that God told them not to do. So right after this, we pick up in verses 2 through 5, and we see something very uncharacteristic up to this point. As I mentioned, Israel they've known nothing but victory up to this point. And then they go into battle, and they lose. They lose to the next town called Ai, or it's probably not pronounced Ai, but we'll call it Ai because you guys know what that means. You've heard it 100 times in the news recently. So they go in there, and they lose. And Joshua's like, what in the heck is going on? This is not the way this is supposed to go. And so he begins to mourn the failure of Israel, and he falls on his face. And while he's praying, I want you to look at his prayer, picking up in verse 7. It says, "Alas, sovereign Lord, why did you ever bring this people across the Jordan to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us? If only we had been content to stay on the other side of the Jordan. Pardon your servant, Lord, what can I say now that Israel has been routed by its enemies? The Canaanites and the other people of the country will hear about this, and they will surround us and wipe out our name from the earth. What then will you do for your own great name?" If you are a reader, an ancient Israelite, especially reading this, that knows anything about the history of Israel, especially their history in the wilderness, this is going to strike an uncomfortable chord with you reading the words of Joshua in this prayer. And the reason why is that Joshua sounds just like the generation that complained in the wilderness. The same generation that made God so angry that he said, you will not enter into the promised land. Joshua sounds just like them. And all the problems that the people in the wilderness had begin to come back to the forefront for the reader. We see that Israel has now fallen into sin. We see that God's anger is burning against them. We find Joshua, their leader, complaining. And we see a failure of leadership on Joshua's part for the first time. Last week, I mentioned something about Joshua as a leader that was important for us to learn from, and that's that Joshua had an order that he followed. And I'm going to say it again because I think it's important for us. You'll see in the first 6 chapters of Joshua that Joshua always heard the voice of the Lord first before he did anything. He would hear the voice of the Lord, then he would go and he would tell the priests what they needed to do, and then he would tell the people. He would hear the voice of God, then he would use the tools of God, then he would communicate to the people of God that were going to follow and go along. But I want you to observe the drastic change that has happened now in the 7th chapter. When we go back and look at verses 2 through 5, you're going to notice that Joshua's order is completely disrupted. In verses 2 through 5, you're not going to find the Lord mentioned one time. His name is not even mentioned one time. There is no Joshua hearing the voice of God. God is not even present in the text. There's no prayer. No one calls upon God. No one consults him and asks him, what should we do? And the other thing that's fascinating is that the spies have played a vital role up until this point, because Joshua has sent spies into the land. He sent them into Jericho to see what the city looked like, and they came back and they said, the Lord has delivered Jericho into our hands. And Joshua himself, part of his story and his testimony was that he was one of the spies back in the time of Moses that went into the land and came back and gave a positive report. But notice what happens here in verses 2 through 5. The spies come back and they give a report, but you know what they do? They step over their responsibilities. They tell Joshua what the battle plan is going to be. They tell Joshua, hey, we don't even need all of our fighting army. We can do it with a quarter of the people, or whatever the number is. They are the ones calling the shots now. It's not Joshua anymore. So we see the order is completely disrupted. It's all out of whack. And the result is inevitable. They lose in battle. They learn the hard way that the Lord is in fact not with them. Because this is something for us to learn, is that we discover the power of God in prayer, not in battle. We discover that God is with us in our time of prayer, not when we go into battle. I remember a long time ago when I was in high school, my dad had a friend, and as part of my dad's friend's ministry, he had a guy that ended up in the NFL, got saved in his ministry, and he played for the Chicago Bears. And so he came into town one weekend, and he said, hey, I got us tickets to go see the Bears because this player that got saved in my ministry, he hooked us up. He's getting us tickets. So we got all excited, and we went down to the Bears game that day, and we went to will call. If you don't know what will call is, that's where you go and pick up your tickets if you don't have them in hand yet. So we get to will call, and this guy gives them his name. And they look up, and there's no tickets under his name. And he says, well, maybe try Chuck Black. That's my dad. Try Chuck Black's name. So they do Chuck Black, and nothing comes up. And then somehow, I'm not sure how my name would even possibly get on the list, but he says, well, try Garrett Black. See if Garrett Black's name's on the list. They put my name in. No, there's no tickets. So finally, after a zillion attempts and different names that we've tried, we come to the conclusion that there are no tickets for us at will call. So we ended up having to go and buy our own tickets to get into the game. And the reason why I bring that story up is this. Any of you, if you've ever gone to an event before, you know, get your tickets before you go to the event. Get your tickets before you go to the event, because you don't go to the event and figure out if you have tickets then. You take care of that beforehand. And the same thing is true for us. In our prayer life, I cannot overstate the importance of prayer, because prayer is when you realize that God is with you. Prayer is when you realize that the power of God is on you. You don't try to figure that out once you get into battle. And that's what the Israelites did. They said, oh, God must be with us. They never consulted him. They get into battle and they find out the hard way that God has not blessed what they went to do. There's another phrase that's missing from this that's very important. And it's this: I have given them into your hands. This is what God would say to the Israelites over and over again before they ever went into battle. He said, I've given them into your hands. That was his way of saying you will have success when you go forward. You will have success when you get into battle, because I have already given them into your hands. And you know what? We only get this in prayer. That's the only time we get this in Scripture, is in prayer. That's when he says it to them. And in the account so far in Joshua chapter 7, it's completely missing. It's not in there because God did not give them his blessing. He did not give the people of Ai over to them. And I think there's a valuable lesson for us today. Again, I cannot overstate the importance of prayer in our life. You don't want to start a new ministry and then figure out if God has blessed it later on. You don't want to make big commitments in life and then figure out later on, I hope God is in this. I hope his stamp of approval is on this. I hope this is within the will of God. We don't want to enter into a business partnership with somebody and then think to ourselves, I hope that God is in this. No, we take care of that way in advance. That's taken care of in prayer. We take care of that in prayer, and then we go in knowing the Lord has blessed this. The Lord has put his stamp of approval on this. Amen? There's some differences between the battle of Jericho and Ai. And some of the differences that we've observed so far have been directly because of the Israelites' negligence. They were neglectful in prayer. They were neglectful in consulting God. And so everything that happened was a direct result of that. They were neglectful in the fact that Achan, as the writer tells us in verse 1, he committed a sin by taking the devoted things. But there's also something different about the battle of Jericho compared to the battle of Ai. Jericho was something called a first fruits offering unto the Lord. Now, if you don't know what a first fruits offering is, I know probably your favorite book of the Bible, Leviticus, when it goes down into all of the details of the different sacrifices that you are to give, you'll notice in there are some sacrifices, not all of them, but some of them, where the offering is to be given and it's fully consumed by the Lord, and no part of it can be taken for a person to consume or to eat. A lot of the other sacrifices were actually offerings that were given to the Lord, but then the priests could actually eat it. It actually was their food. That's how the priests got their food, was through the sacrifices, so they could partake from it after the fact. But for the first fruits offering, there was no partaking. It was completely set apart unto God, which means that sacrifice would offer no benefit to the people after the fact. There was no benefit to them, a physical benefit to them after the fact. And this was actually the nature of the instructions that God gave to the Israelites concerning Jericho. It was supposed to be an offering unto God in its entirety. Now, the reason why that's important is because it was very common when you would go into battle, it was very common to take plunder from the battle. You would go in, you would rule over a city in battle, and you would take plunder from it. This was very common practice. But for Jericho, the first battle, the first city that they're going to overtake, God says, do not take anything from it. Have nothing in your hands when you leave this city. And having nothing in your hands does not mean that you didn't win. It just means that all of it is dedicated unto me. And you need to know that it's okay if you have nothing to show from your victory. It's okay if you have nothing to show from your victory. There are some things in our lives that are better off in God's hands rather than in ours. God can do much more with it than we could ever do with it. There are some things that are better off in God's hands than in ours. For not for all things, but for some things in our walk with God, the lack of a trophy is actually a good thing. And this is the reason why. Because when you don't have anything to show from your victory, it's because you were completely dependent on God to do it in the first place. We should all have a testimony in our lives where we say, I don't know how it happened. I have no idea how it happened. All I know is that God did it for me. I have nothing to show for it. I can't show you my grades. I can't show you my resume. I can't show you an award that I won. I can't show you any of that. All I know is that God did it for me. That's all I have. That is your takeaway. That is your trophy. It's your testimony. That's what you get to walk away with. It's not always like that, but sometimes it's like that. And all of us need to have those stories in our lives. But here's the problem. That was supposed to be the story of every Israelite. But Achan had something to show for it. And that was a problem. Because God said, do not take anything. And Achan did. The reason why Achan's sin was so bad is there's a few reasons. Last week we talked about the Battle of Jericho sometimes can make us a little bit uncomfortable about the things that God had the Israelites do, and we journeyed through that. And this instance here may bring up some of the same feelings. I mean, I'll spoil the story right now. Achan and his entire family, God ends up wiping them off the face of the earth. That's the end of this story. Spoiler, right there. Why was the punishment so severe? Well, let's talk about that. Let's not run away from it. Let's address it. Deuteronomy 7:25 through 26. I want you to look at what Moses told the Israelites before they ever got into the promised land. He says, the images of their gods, referring to the gods of the cities that you're going to go into in the promised land, you are to burn in the fire. Do not covet the silver and gold on them, and do not take it for yourselves, or you will be ensnared by it, for it is detestable to the Lord your God. Do not bring a detestable thing into your house, or you, like it, will be set apart for destruction. Regard it as vile, and utterly detest it, for it is set apart for destruction. Look at the language that he uses. Consider it to be vile. How often do you use the word vile in your day-to-day? Because you don't come across things that are absolutely vile. It's the most disgusting of disgusting of disgusting. He says that's how you are to consider the things that you come across in these cities. Vile and utterly detestable. But then you could say, okay, well, that was back in Deuteronomy, right? Maybe Achan has forgotten since then. It's been a long time. Let's cut him a break, all right? Many of us forget things that we just were told 5 minutes ago. How is Achan going to remember this? Well, let's look at Joshua 6:17 through 19 before they go into the city. Look at what Joshua says to them. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. This is literally as they're running into Jericho. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies that we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise you will make the camp of Israel liable for destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury. Achan wasn't just stealing from plunder. He was stealing from the Lord. Joshua said this all belongs to the Lord. It's sacred, it's holy, and set apart unto him. Achan stole from God. He didn't steal from just a pile of rubbish that nothing was going to happen to. He stole from the Lord. And you know what's crazy about Achan when he's compared to Rahab in the story before this? Rahab was a pagan from a Canaanite city, and she obeyed the Lord better than Achan did. And Achan was an Israelite. He was a part of the people of God, but he behaved like a pagan himself in his behavior. Achan's sin compromised the entire nation of Israel. When I was in high school, I got to witness something that was very troubling, actually. I was in class one day, and there was a student that was sitting across from me, and in the middle of class, I remember something dropped out of his pocket, and he really quickly picked it up and put it back in his pocket. And this particular student, I know there was some rumors going around that he was going to get in a fight with another student after school that day over a girl, because that's the best way to handle it, you know. So he comes to school that day, and I remember seeing something fall out of his pocket, and then I remember a couple periods later, I found out that he ended up getting taken down to the principal's office because they found a knife on him. He had brought a knife to school, presumably because of this fight. I don't know what he was planning on doing with it, but he brought a knife to school, and that's what fell out of his pocket in the middle of class. I remember I saw it, and he picked it up really quick. Well, as you can probably figure out the end of this story, he gets expelled from school. Not suspended, he gets expelled from school. That's kind of what we all expected. But what we didn't expect was another student that wasn't even involved in any of it. He wasn't the other kid that he was going to fight. He had nothing to do with the girl, nothing. This kid gets expelled too. And we're like, what happened? How did he get expelled as well? Well, apparently, after this kid knew that him having a knife was public knowledge, he convinced this other kid to hide the knife in his locker so that he wouldn't get caught. And the school found out about it. So they go to this kid's locker, they open it up, and they find the knife in his locker. And he also got expelled because he had the knife. The reason why I share that is it's the exact same dynamic of what happened with Achan. This boy that took the knife from the other kid and hid it in his locker, he held an object that was worthy of expulsion. And so he paid the price that the person that got expelled paid as well, because he had the object with him as well. And Achan held in his possession an object that was worthy of destruction, and he brought it into his own tent. He took something that he knew belonged to the Lord. There's no doubt about it. It belonged to the Lord. It was a pagan idol, and he decided, I'm going to bring it into my tent. I'm going to align myself with this object. And so he pays the exact same price. And as I mentioned, his sin compromises the entire nation of Israel. You know what happens? I've already mentioned some of these, but while Achan has this idol in his tent, we find that Israel, they don't pray. They don't consult God. They had confidence in their own ability. They said, we can go into the land and we could take it over with a quarter of the soldiers. And they were completely unaware of God's presence not being with them. They were completely unaware of it. Here's the lesson for us. We cannot bring an idol into our tent and think that it won't affect anything else in our lives. We cannot bring an idol into our life and think, I'll just let it chill over here and everything else will be okay. The presence of the idol in one man's tent in Israel disrupted the entire spiritual flow of Israel. They don't pray, they're confident in themselves, and they're unaware of God's presence with them. Idols are a marriage. Idols are a marriage. Achan literally takes these objects and he takes them back to his tent. He takes them back to his tent, and now he's being led by an idol instead of being led by the God of Israel. And this is the thing that fascinates me about this. If you look at the imagery that's happening here, God, where does he dwell before Jesus? He dwells in a tent, which is the tabernacle, and then he dwells in a temple, which is later built for him. Where does Achan take his idol? He takes it into his tent. What's happening here? Achan is literally giving a place. He's setting up these idols to be the ruler in his household. That's what's happening. Just like Yahweh dwells within a tent because he's the ruler of Israel and his presence is with them. Achan is setting up these idols in his home, and they become the ruler of his life. In all, what we see here is that Achan is in full rebellion towards God. That's what's happening. Because idols always empower rebellion. That's what they do. Idols always empower rebellion. And when the Israelites, they get Achan, and he finally confesses what he's done, I want you to look at the words, just so you see the nature of idolatry. It says in verse 21 in chapter 7 there, when I saw in the plunder a beautiful robe from Babylonia, 200 shekels of silver and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels, I coveted them and took them. They are hidden in the ground inside my tent with the silver underneath. Here's one thing I want to point out to you. Achan, even in his confession, he calls it plunder. The reason why that's significant is because it's already been made very clear to him that that was not plunder. Those were devoted items unto the Lord. Achan still won't come to terms with the fact that he had no right to pick up what he picked up. He became convinced that he had a right to the very things that God said were off limits. Does this sound familiar to you at all? Maybe back in the story of Genesis, when the serpent comes in and says, surely God did not tell you that you could eat of this tree. Because what idols do is they convince you that you have access to something that God told you you do not have access to. And that's precisely what happens with Achan. The other thing, too, that's interesting is that it says it was a Babylonian robe that he held. And I think there's a reason why it goes into detail about what kind of robe it was. If you know the rest of the story of Israel, Israel ends up going into captivity again. They just came out of captivity in Egypt because God set them free, brought them to the promised land. But because of their unfaithfulness, their disobedience, they end up going into captivity again. Where? In Babylon. The reason why that's significant is because an idol will not hide its endgame with you. An idol will not hide its endgame with you. An idol always has oppression and enslavement on its mind. That's why it was a Babylonian robe, because it knew the ultimate destination of where it would lead. And that's what happens when we bring an idol into our life. Just so you know, there's only one end game with idolatry. It's oppression, it's confinement, enshacklement, and enslavement. Because that's what idols do. I think the saddest part about all this is that because of Achan's rebellion, God does not bless the battle that they go into. Because God cannot bless rebellion. He cannot do it. Achan decided to align himself with rebellion, and they forfeited the blessing of God in the process. Would you do me a favor today and just stand on your feet? I know for us, the idea of idolatry can seem so foreign because for them, it was quite literally a physical thing that they would hold in their hands, just like Achan had. He found these physical objects that were appealing to his eyes, and he took them. He couldn't control himself. He couldn't restrain the temptation within him. And we think, well, that idolatry, we don't have these little figurines anymore. We don't have to really worry about that. But the fact of the matter is, idolatry is alive and well today. And it's the exact same thing that the enemy is still trying to get you and I to do. Because this is how the enemy can get us to forfeit the freedom that we have in God, is by introducing idolatry into our life. It's usually not, you don't even notice it at first. He kind of wiggles it in a little bit. And then next thing you know, you're like, yeah, I'm going to pick this up. You notice how familiar Achan was with all the different aspects of the things that he had picked up? He knew the exact amount of coins. He knew how much it weighed. He knew where the robe was from. Why? Because how many times do you think he went to his tent when nobody was looking and he picked them up and he looked at them? And he counted the coins. And he weighed it. And he held up that robe and looked at all the embroidery on it. Because slowly it was pulling him in and pulling him in and pulling him in. And he was requesting his allegiance to it instead of God. And so I know this is not the most encouraging ending, and this is not the run out the doors and the excitement of the Lord, but it's something that needs to be addressed, because this is how the enemy will try to get you to give up your allegiance to God is by introducing idolatry into your life.